Welcome to Two Truths, where we explore controversial ideas in religion, philosophy, and history from at least two different perspectives. I'm Dr. Darren Iammarino, and today we're going to be talking about something a little bit sinister. We're going to be looking at Satanism, sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you will. There are a lot of videos out there on Satanism. This one's going to be a bit different because I don't think too many people have heard of some of the groups that I'm going to be focusing on, and almost certainly you haven't heard about some of the details that we're going to go into. And even taking the stance of here are some positive or valuable aspects coming out of these theories and groups. You don't hear that every day, right? So here's where we're going to start on our timeline. Not that far back. Unlike some of my other videos where we're going back 2,500 years or more, we're only going back to about the 1960s and 1970s. And the groups that we want to sort of focus on are going to be the Church of Satan from the mid-60s under Anton LaVey. And then in the 70s, we're going to have these other two groups that are going to come about. One of which, the next one, the Temple of Set, is a branch-off group from the Church of Satan. And that's going to be under Michael Aquino. Last but not least, definitely not least, the Order of Nine Angles, which has also grown in popularity in recent decades and is arguably the most intense and extreme of all of these different groups. The Order of Nine Angles, you typically are going to find a name David Myatt that's going to be associated with it, at least when we're talking about the 70s, 80s, and 90s. All right, so that sort of sets us up. We'll see later on there's going to be another group that gets brought into the mix, a more recent but quite popular satanic group called the Satanic Temple, but we're kind of moving on our timeline, so that won't be until a little bit later, right? Now, surprise, surprise, almost all these groups don't like each other, right? Protestants and Catholics have had their fights for hundreds of years, right? Hasn't taken long for these different satanic groups to disagree with one another. For example, the Temple of Set and the Order of Nine Angles, really, both of these groups are going to think that the first group, Church of Satan, under Anton LaVey, became too materialistic. You would get promoted up the ranks partially and in great measure based upon your financial success as one metric. But as Michael Aquino, who breaks off from the Church of Satan, will point out, I mean, there are a lot of rich idiots, right? You don't actually have to be creative, inspired, or brilliant to become financially well off. So for the Temple of Set, that's going to be a really poor metric. And really that means that you've lost your mandate, if you will. All right. So under Michael Aquino and the Temple of Set, there's going to be another pretty interesting shift where the earlier Church of Satan is atheistic. That might come as a shock, like, well, okay, they don't believe in God. That might not be a huge shocker, but they also don't really believe that the devil or Satan is a real entity. Instead, it's a symbol, right, for rebellion. carnality, individualism, things like this. Okay? It is a great symbol, but for the Temple of Set, this second group, they do believe that there is actually sort of a dark entity, and it's called Temple of Set, S-E-T, for a reason. As in the Egyptian god Set. So here we have an attempt to tie way, way, way back, historically, on the timeline, to ancient Egypt, early days even, early dynasties of ancient Egypt. And this idea that somehow Set is a real figure with agency and was there in Egypt, but essentially those who truly worshipped him kind of disappeared, died off, but has now come back. And there's this idea of there being like maybe cycles or eons. That's going to be a big idea in a lot of Western occult tradition. These different phases, very similar to, I guess, maybe this idea of like there being yugas within Hinduism and different religions in India. However, the cycles are much shorter, I'd say. The time scale is much shorter than these cycles that you get in India. So that's a little bit about the Temple of Set, okay? They do believe, I guess you could say, theistic form of Satanism. They do believe that there's this actual entity. It's not just a symbol. And they're focused heavily, the Temple of Set, on intellectual growth. That's sort of what makes one elite. That's going to be a big issue, elitism. Does being rich make you elite? Or part of some secret club, whatever, make you elite? Or is it having genuine knowledge and wisdom, which is what the Temple of Set is definitely going to push more in that direction, right? Or when we get to our third group that I'm kind of holding for the majority of this video, the Order of Nine Angles, is it really going to be a level of intensity and antinomianism, like ability to break the law and endure ordeals, tremendous physical, even like endurance and trials? Is that sort of what is critical for creating an elite individual? But regardless of where you stand on this, elitism is an important issue, all right, for all of these groups. Let's look at some texts really quickly, just to name some key texts that go along with these three groups. The Church of Satan has the Satanic Bible. Became wildly popular. Why? Because the founder, Anton LaVey, was a phenomenal PR, right, public relations expert. Right? Next up, Temple of Set. There are a lot of different works, by the way, for each of these groups, but just to name one. The Book of Coming Forth by Night. Great title because it ties back to ancient Egyptian ideas like the Book of Coming Forth by Day, otherwise known as like the Book of the Dead. So that is sort of this like revelation from Set through Michael Aquino, who's the leader and founder, right, of the Temple of Set, or was. Okay. Third text, the Black Book of Satan for the Order of Nine Angles. The Order of Nine Angles outpaces all these other groups in literature. And that's partially because of the power of the internet and things. Right? But those are just three main texts that if you wanted to dive deeper into understanding contemporary Satanism and its different iterations, those are three places you could look to start. Another thing that's going to be maybe shared by all of these groups, or at least most, is this idea of like what black magic really is. White magic's a BS even category, for a lot of these individuals. So black magic is sort of seen as consciously self-beneficial. It's not evil, according to these groups. The idea behind like white magic, that you're somehow only dealing with healing or good things and helping others, or white light, divine light, is bogus for these people. It's a false consciousness, and it's actually self-gratifying in the end. And I'm not going to maybe go so far as, this debate doesn't particularly even interest me that much, to be honest. But I will say they might make a pretty good point. I think a lot of people that are in this sort of occult realm, believing that they're somehow in like this white magic domain, are deluding themselves in a pretty big way at times. Right? What makes Satanism in its modern forms interesting is that you'll get a distinction with the Temple of Set between what's called lesser black magic and greater black magic. Now, those are categories you maybe have never heard of before, right? Lesser black magic is understood as sort of what Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan are really good at. Public relations, marketing, advertising. Really, what is like social media advertising and stuff now? It's this targeted, powerful thing to alter people's behaviors, right? It is almost magical. But that's going to be like lesser form of black magic. The greater form of black magic is going to be changing your subjective universe. Okay? Your perspective. Anything that's going to help your coming into being and being more powerful and greater than you once were, right? That might entail ceremonial magic as well, or more traditional forms of magic, or maybe magic spelled with a K, if some people want to use that. So that's a distinction that you will find in a lot of their texts, especially with the Temple of Set, okay? Making that differentiation there between lesser and greater black magic. So I think a good thing to do now is shift into some quotes, but also sort of shifting focus to the Order of Nine Angles, since they hold a place of radical, intense, extreme. Those three words pretty much summarize a lot of their theory and practice, which should be clear in a couple minutes after listening to some of these quotes. Here's a quote taken from some of their literature relating to just general theory, okay? For us, Satanism is all about the creation of proud, strong, characterful, insightful individuals. Individuals who have gone beyond the majority and who thus represent a higher type. Genuine satanic groups do not seek subservient, decadent, weak-willed followers. They seek to create an elite, almost a new race of beings. So that's one quote. A lot of stuff packed into there. Interesting things. We'll see how some of those concepts play out here in a few minutes as I bring in some of these other issues. Now, let's read a couple more quotes. This is coming from what's called the 21 Satanic Points. And this is in, I believe, in the Black Book of Satan for the Order of Nine Angles. I'm taking these at random. I'm not just going with like giving you the first four. Just some that I think are interesting. Come as a fresh, strong wind that breaks, yet also creates. sort of that antinomian spirit again there. Here's another one. Respect not pity or weakness, for they are a disease which makes sick the strong. That kind of gives you a bit of the flavor for where they're going to really be going. So does this. Test always your strength, for therein lies success. Right? So you can see they're going to be about definitely putting yourself into an ordeal all the time, which leads us to these last two, which are going to be a great, I think, segue for us. Learn to raise yourself above yourself so you can triumph over all. Now, take that one and kind of relate it and combine it to this next one, which will be the last one we look at. He who stands atop the highest pyramid of skulls can see the furthest. Now, sounds kind of cool. I don't know, a bit sinister again, but what they're getting at with these last two that I mentioned is a very important point. And that takes us now into, like I said, I want to look at what I think that some of these groups do well, where their ideas actually could be valuable for all people. And then lastly, we'll look at like, that might be a problem or might be conflicting with other ideas. Okay. So let's sort of segue from those last two quotes into this core concept. Very big for the Order of Nine Angles, but also employed by other satanic groups and other forms of like Western occult, some esoteric groups. Insight roles. We could call it paradigm shifting, perhaps, or active paradigm shifting. Here's what this means. Let's give some examples. The main name, who sort of is the modern mouthpiece and popularizes the Order of Nine Angles, this David Myatt, he, at one point in time, ends up going to the Middle East, converting to Islam, when yet he was in basically, England, Western Europe, okay? So basically jumping to a different part of the world, a totally different ideology and mindset. And the reason why you do this, hence insight role, right? You gain both insight into how other people think, but also power, right? It's not about, I'm questioning and I think they might be right. Maybe I want to actually just like convert and be a Muslim forever in this case. It's no, let me do this for, in his case, many years. I think it was like 8 years, but it might only be a few months or something like that to take on an insight role. And I gain power by doing it. Like, let's say, as a different example, I'm a Democrat or something, right? And I go and I move to a very deep red state and I try living there for 3 months and embrace the culture completely, right? Total immersion into this new world. Again, who much cares whether someone's right or wrong, if that even makes sense on a grander scale? It is a fact that if I now know how to navigate that world, I know how those type of people think, right? The decisions that they make, I'm better informed. I can pull some good things maybe, right? From those different groups those different ideologies. I think there's real truth in this and power in this, but I think it's also extremely dangerous. You have to be someone who's very well grounded first, because you easily can just slip into different delusions, right? If you're not anchored properly doing something like this. So I do think a distinction ought to be made between, like, here's an insight roll that you do one time only, or here's an insight roll that you don't do until you're at a certain level of understanding or cultivation. And once you reach that point, you should repeat that sort of like insight roll for a long time, but you shouldn't do it before you reach that point. So I think you should distinguish that way. And then versus things that you might want to do forever. You might still need to cultivate to a certain point, but it's something that you take on that you never leave. Like, it's just an added piece to you, maybe. So I think, like, there's just ways to sort of get more refined in an understanding of various paradigm shifting or insight roles. So more to say on that in a little bit when we get to the sort of the bad, if you will, section. Okay? Another thing that I think Satanism has done really well, all these groups, I think, actually can share this, especially Church of Satan and the more contemporary one, the temple, the Satanic temple. Both of these groups have done a good job with the elevation of women. All right? Flipping the role of women being unfortunately oppressed, right, for all thousands of years, all these other religions and cultures, to flip that is a great thing. It should have happened a long time ago. Aside from Tantra in India and maybe a couple other smaller movements at various points in time, there hasn't been much of this. And that is something that the contemporary pagan maybe world at large, even beyond Satanism, has done a really good job with. So that's something that I would put in a good column, if you will, here. All right? Now, something else that you don't hear every day. The re-sanctification of the role of chaos. Now, not all of these satanic groups are going to talk about this in this way, but chaos, like women, like foreigners, these groups that might have been marginalized, it's something that we should push out. Religion is about keeping order for society, for the cosmos, for the individual, whatever, right? And anything that is a threat to that order should be marginalized or eradicated. But what they're saying is, like, no, we need to call for seeing that it's holy, the power of randomness, chaos, spontaneity, stuff like that. I think that's another really positive dimension. Sort of spinning off of that, one last piece that I think is really good here, and now it's time to bring in briefly the Satanic Temple, which is a more recent, I don't remember the exact dates, it's kind of hard to say, but we're not talking about more than about 15 years, I think, or so. And I believe they're primarily operating out of Salem, Massachusetts. Not sure. I think so. But this group is a very left-leaning political group, also atheistic. So, much like the Church of Satan in the 60s, I think there's more comparisons between the Church of Satan here, although they definitely disagree with one another, but I think there's more similarities between that group, the Church of Satan, and the Satanic Temple. So you have this sort of like leftist activist mentality. But what makes this group interesting is they have a really strong, they make a strong case for this trickster, almost like Loki ideology. And here's some examples. When in Oklahoma they try to put the Ten Commandments out in front of a government building, this satanic group basically applies. So they're like, hey, look, if you do that, then I want my Baphomet statue placed right next to it. And in the end, it blows everything up kind of, and it doesn't end up happening. They manage to shut down putting the Ten Commandments right there. That's just but one example of this sort of activist tendency and focusing on cooperative strategies rather than more just only the individual. Because I do think that's important and something that's missed in a lot of the other satanic movements. There is way too much of a focus on just the individual, and I understand maybe why they're doing that, and the philosophical theoretical foundations of where they're getting stuff like that, but it's a problem for even achieving larger goals down the road. All right, let's shift gears once again and look at some critiques where I think that they go awry, if you will. The biggest thing that's a problem is going to be something called accelerationism. Right? You might not hear that word every day. This is troubling to try to define because you have very left-leaning forms of this politically and in terms of activism, and then you have extremely far right. Now, when it comes to the satanic movements, it's the far, far, far right, typically, in the order of 9 angles that are going to be big on this. Part of the idea here is that they want to accelerate capitalist tendencies, accelerate technological tendencies, because there's this there's eons, right? These periods of time that go through specific cycles within that larger framework. So you'll have a period of things like rising, and then there'll be a time of crisis, and then there's going to be a period where there's almost a military type imperium in control. A lot of these groups, they want to accelerate getting to that phase of this imperium, right? Or maybe even having an Aryan sort of ethno-state situation. But the real goal is not planetary only. They want long-term goal to try to achieve a galactic civilization. It, to me, sounds like your Kardashev type 1 civilization, or even type 2, I guess. Type 2 or type 3, where you get to a galactic civilization. We're way far away from something like that. But trying to propose that could happen, or there could be an Aryan galactic thing, just sounds so unlikely to unfold that it almost just feels a bit distracting. I do think there's good points with accelerationism when it comes to the idea that trying to deal with capitalism somehow externally is no good. Any of the destruction or reforms, capitalism will destroy and reform itself far faster and better than it could be from some external source. I think that there's a good case for something along those lines. But again, it's not abundantly clear always. There's this fascist, very kind of neo-Nazi element going on a lot of the time. And I think that could just be a bit confusing in terms of agendas. And speaking of that, that kind of leads us into this idea of taking a political side. To me, it's a bit weird to be super far right and then not, even with the insight roles, like I mentioned earlier, even if you're far right, I think you should probably try and go way left, not again because they are right, just because your power will increase. And you need to have an increase in power in order to achieve a lot of the goals that they otherwise might have, such as immortality, all right? Which is a goal for like the Temple of Set and for the Order of Nine Angles. Definitely both talk about the possibility of becoming immortal. In fact, it's the seventh, the highest rank stage degree that you can get to for the Order of Nine Angles, trying to become an immortal, linked to these like dark gods, which they're going to talk about, which I think is another problem, and I'm going to get to in a second. But the biggest concern that I would say that I have when it comes to mainly the Order of Nine Angles. Now, the other satanic groups, the Church of Satan, Temple of Set, and the Satanic Temple, all these groups are going to have serious issues with how extreme the Order of Nine Angles will be. They will advocate for criminal activity of the highest kind, terrorism type stuff, mass murder, rape, whatever things that you can think of. Understanding why boils back down again to power, psychological control, right? They might have a point that pretty much all of us are trapped in the enculturation process that we went through. And it's making us weak in some ways, right? Like you can understand this like Nietzsche-inspired call to greatness, to a will to power, to a Superman, right? An Ubermensch idea. I mean, I get maybe where they're coming at with that, and all my other videos, as I point out, there is something to be said for you need temperature and pressure, intensity to create like a phase change in physics. But when you're taking away other people's even ability completely through, say, murder, right, to form their own, right, the power base, who knows, maybe you just killed off someone who would have been critical for the larger movement. Now granted, they have criteria for who would, make for someone that should be like cold or whatever, but I still think it's a problem. If nothing else, there's a decent chance you're going to get arrested. A lot of these people have. Well, when you're in prison, that pretty dramatically narrows your range of insight roles and, power you can exert. So I think there needs to be some level of maybe suggestion of like, hey, let's do some antinomian acts, but probably not going here if for no other reason that there's a decent probability of it decreasing our goal in the grand scheme, right? So that takes us now to kind of this last issue where I do have some unique things to say that you're not going to hear anywhere else for sure on any other video, because a lot of it's coming from my own personal work in metaphysics and theology. So all these groups, all right, the Satanic Temple, the Church of Satan, the Temple of Set, the Order of Nine Angles, I think they can be united in a way on a new type of theory where some are atheistic, right? These groups, some are theistic. Now, I do think there are types of theism that you'll never hear about normally that stay within the domain of science and physicalism as we know it today, that would get you to something where the people that are focused on more of this idea of an acausal realm of dark gods, like the Temple said, or Order of Nine Angles, to have some common ground with these more atheistic groups that might be open to what I'm about to say. All right. Now, this whole idea, first off, of like there being dark gods sounds very much like an H.P. Lovecraft inspired thing. And there's something that the Order of Nine Angles talks about called the Star Game that helps you to connect with them and the eons and all this, which to me sounds like they're just taking something from the earlier Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, an earlier esoteric group that was important in the West, because they had something called, I think, Enochian chess. So it just to me sounds like they're kind of borrowing from that, but it feels kind of childish to suggest this like game like that and talking about these dark gods that are in an acausal realm and we're in this causal realm. I don't know. The theology sounds very kind of just not very cohesive to me. There are ways now that you can connect these things. For example, I would say there's something called hypnotheism. I wouldn't try and look it up because I don't think there's going to be much of anything there. But there have been physicists, mainstream, Western physicists, in the last 35, 40 years that have written papers in prestigious journals who have talked about cosmology and where the cosmos is heading and where it's likely to end. Now, we can know a lot about that, which might shock you because you're like, how could we know about something billions, more than that type of thing into the future? It's because that's the whole point of physics, right? If you know enough about the state of the system, you can extrapolate. So there are ideas of how a godlike being, a consciousness, a sort of cosmic type consciousness, if you will, could think and operate, I guess you could say, effectively, even given the problems that are going to occur with entropy, all right? And as we get way, way, way deep into the future. So there is this notion that a god could effectively like shut down temporarily, take breaks. And that's where this like hypno, like I said, almost like sleep form of theism. And perhaps that's why we've had these religions in the past that are talking about connection to a god very easily. And nowadays we don't really hear as much about prophets and revelation in that way. Maybe it's because this god's effectively like shutting down temporarily because of energy usage and efficiency. Not saying I think that is particularly likely, but it's an alternative model. Another alternative model is panentheism, coming from like process theology and something like that, where you can have a form of religion and science, not religion versus science, and they can kind of be harmonized quite well. Don't have time to go into that. It's for another video maybe. But from like process philosophy and panentheism, the idea that all things are in God, but not the same as God. So you can still have an immanent or a transcendent component to God and an immanent component to God, but other things separate from that aren't exactly the same as God. That's kind of panentheism. But the most interesting to me is something I've been working on recently, and we'll wrap today's video with this. And it's the idea that's coming more from this guy Roger Penrose, of there being what he calls his CCC theory, conformal cyclic cosmology. And he basically proposes that the universe has gone through many, who knows how many cycles. And as it goes through each cycle, you are dealing with huge time frames, right? And when you're dealing with massive time spans, it allows for very seemingly illogical things to materialize, according to even physics. Okay? For example, feel free to do a little research on something called a Boltzmann brain. All right? BRAIN, like our brain. Right? That almost anything that could materialize will, through time, an insane amount of time though, by the way, and there being some level of consistent energy source. All right, I don't even have time to get into the details, but like, for example, on like a cosmological horizon or around a black hole or something, where there's effectively particles being produced, that eventually things will crash into one another. Atomic elements will be made. Those will combine. You'll have, molecules, and you could basically make a brain almost, if you will, from scratch. You can make anything else though from scratch. The idea though here is that you're not violating science at all or physics at all, and you could even create what I advocated for, which would be much easier to do, I think, a much thinner, less complicated in terms of the intricate structure of a membrane. Right? So a Boltzmann membrane or brain, BRANE, right? Why bring all this up? I feel like I've lost on my whole thing on Satanism. No, because they talk about dark gods, and to me that also sounds like something that could be around a black hole or around a cosmological horizon, and our ability to maybe like tap into that. But the difference is I'm talking about something that might still seem extremely improbable, but it at least is possible within the realm of contemporary physics, and you're not having to resort to either like full science fiction or like horror type genres to help inform your theology, or unusual theosophical or like ideas from vaguely borrowed from Hinduism and just mixed in with other ideas. I think that's where they kind of are going to lose a lot of people. Look at Scientology, right? They lost a lot of people because of when it just gets weird, right? On the excessively sci-fi piece. So I think that if they explored these more like unique, advanced, cutting edge type ideas, it could almost help to unify and make things seem more profound overall and realistic. All right. So that's it for today. A lot of stuff on Satanism, right? And if ever there's a time in any of my videos to use my now standard sign off, right? I always say, stay gray. And with Satanism, that's probably the best place to be.